Hi, I'm Tony, and today on Tony Talks Tabletop, I'll be talking about the timeline of my setting and how I went about getting it organized. So this is a basic little chart that I used. Up here, I'm going to be putting the timeline of events, and along here, I'll be putting the groups that are reacting to the timeline and their actions in sequence. Kind of gives you a storyboard. So with that, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing that happens is the first folk, which are the people that are first sent to the island, are sent to the island. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go up the list this way. So we have the first folk, we have the common folk, we have the crown, we have the church, we have the Draymonts, which are like my vampire hunters, you can tell, very derivative. We have the vampire lord, and we have the hags and witches. Okay, so the first folk arrive on the island. They're a mix of refugees, convicts, and religious zealots. There's a war going on in the mainland, so this country's trying to expand. There's an island that's uninhabited, well, uninhabited by humans, and they send some people there. So the common folk stayed on the mainland. They're still at war, and they're struggling and hungry. The crown sends a lot of first folk to the island, along with a bunch of nobles to rule over them. The church sends a lot of first folk to the island for religious conquest. Both of these groups, the crown and the church, are sending a lot of convicts for their own purposes. But a lot of the people that the church sends are sent there specifically for religious conquest. And many of the people that they send, actually I should add that to both, many of the people that they send do die due to negligence. The Draymonts are first folk immigrants at the time, and they immediately start studying the biology of the island. They are martially trained, but their interest is to get away from military conquest. They didn't agree with some of the politics that were happening on the mainland. They decided this was their chance to get out. So they're immigrants, and they're just learning everything they can about their new home. So the vampire lord is still a human. He's one of the first folk, and he was sent here for religious conquest. So you can consider him kind of like a crusader. You know, he's a religious warrior at the behest of the church. The hags were already on the island. Their origin at this point remains unknown, but they start kidnapping and coercing people into their service, and that's who the witches are. The next thing that happens, the island turns against the church and the crown. And what I mean by that is the hags and the witches turn against them. This is probably about like 10 to 15 years later, so some of the babies that they've kidnapped have grown into young adults. You know, they have numbers. They've been coercing people, working against them on the inside. And so the hags and witches are working against them, along with some other lesser forces that don't really need to be mentioned here. But suffice it to say, the island itself turns against the church and the crown, and a lot of people have to escape. So many of the first folk die when this happens, but some of them survive, and they adopt the new ways over time. So they gain their identity as the first folk, separate from the common folk on the island, you know, leading up to this event and especially after it. The common folk are still on the mainland, warring with the surrounding countries. So just generally not doing well. Between these two, it's about, 10 years or so. I'll just mark up here like 10 to 15 years. As far as the crown goes, most of the nobles are killed during this event, but some of them do survive, and they begin to adopt the new ways, just like the first folk, because after this point, they are first folk nobles. Okay. Most of the nobles during this event are killed, but some of them survive, and they become the first folk nobles, along with some other people that are inserted as nobles later. Now, the church is completely toppled by the island entities. The people who do escape and go back to the mainland will come back with tales of this stuff. So some people do end up escaping and going back. But the ones who stay and survive become the first folk. The Draymonts by this time have become monster hunters. In studying the biology of the island, they end up learning things that other people just don't know, and just through happenstance defend some people or show them how to defend themselves from, just battling the wildlife. Maybe it's even just teaching them about the hunting patterns of a predator that's hitting their livestock. So they've become monster hunters, and they defend the people during this crisis. Now, the Vampire Lord, at this point, he is, like I said, he's a warrior that works for the church. So his wife and child actually die during the crisis. He's out defending on behalf of the church, and there are some people that are put in charge of protecting the families of those warriors who are out there defending on behalf of the church. Well, they fail. His wife and child die, but when he comes back, the people who are responsible for their protection are still alive. So he massacres them, he curses his god, and he becomes a vampire. There's a longer version of that story, but that's the synopsis. And you don't have to know everything for your storyline. You don't have to have every single detail. You just have to have enough that you understand exactly what's going on, and you can guide the story from there. Now, the hags and witches, they turn against the church and crown, but they lose the hag mother during this event, which is like an otherworldly entity that they worship that leads them. They have a coven of covens, so a triplicate of threes. There's 3 pairs of threes of the hags that all worshipped the hag mother, and they lose her during this event. So they lose quite a bit of power during this event. Okay, now at this time, during this whole section, the mainland kingdoms are at war, but they do eventually, like the common folk, eventually win/survive. I call surviving a win. So they win in the sense that they survive this event as a people. They don't necessarily conquer the whole continent. Now, I will say this whole thing, all these wars, it takes anywhere from 30 to 40 years. So this section here, these two kind of took a 10 to 15 year span. This one leading into here, so this is like the tail end of a 30-year period. So the first folk build a civilization, and their culture at this point is completely unique from the mainland. They have been here for, anywhere from 40 to 55, almost 60 years. So their culture is completely different from the mainlands at this point. So the common folk are experiencing a period of growth and wealth on the mainland. They are essentially feeling well, it might be time to start expanding again. That's kind of how this culture decided to be. Okay, so the crown is expanding on the mainland. During this period of growth, they're, slowly expanding their borders, taking in new peoples and new treasures, and they're feeling good. Now, for the nobles that survived on the island, they adapted. They are now the first folk nobles. The church has been expanding on the mainland. They, along with the crown, they're heavily tied together, are expanding their influence and bringing new people in, and with that, more power. The Draymonts at this point, during this 30 to 40 years, they're hunting monsters and learning magics that they deem acceptable. So, things that might slightly enhance them, but nothing on the level of The Witcher, nothing like that. It's just, small stuff, small enhancements to themselves and things that they can do that don't require any large sacrifices or for them to do anything uncouth, dishonorable. They're also beginning to investigate the Vampire Lord and the hags and witches at this point. So the Vampire Lord at this point is studying ancient magic and he's, trying to figure out some way to, kind of repeat what happened to him, make new vampires. He's also trying to take a wife and have kids. He's, just trying to get back something that he feels his god took from him, or his renounced god took from him. He also begins to hate the Draymonts because they are interfering in his actions, even though they can't figure out what kind of monster it is, because there's no vampires on the island. They don't know what he is, they're just kind of investigating him. The hags and witches at this point are starting their experiments to make a new hag mother. And also at this point, one of the hags and the vampire lord do actually have a child. Her biology is that from, it's different from that of a human, but they do successfully have a child. He goes to visit them and she doesn't have the child. He freaks out, like, what's going on? Where's our child? And she essentially, like, really blasé about it, goes, oh, well, it came to a vote and I voted against it, but we decided to use the child in an experiment. So so he resents the hags beyond all measure. And I haven't quite decided how he retaliated at that time, but whatever happened here, I'm just kind of leaving that as a footnote. It doesn't affect the larger story other than he hates them, even though he knows he could reproduce with them. He sees it as, they're not even an option because of their, really messed up ethics. And that's coming from a vampire lord, so these guys are messed up. Okay, so at this point, the current ruling king dies, and a new king is crowned. This new king sends his brother to the island to rule as duke, essentially to get him out of the way. And if he ends up dying, fine, whatever. And if he succeeds, we have a new kingdom over there. So the first folk at this point are just trying to survive the onslaught of new people coming into the island and new beliefs and people trampling over their ideals and their customs and everything. And at this point, the resistance is formed. So let's add the resistance. The resistance is formed from first folk who felt threatened by the crown and church, and the fact that their culture was essentially being threatened to be erased. So the common folk, they arrive on the island, and many of them just start getting sick. So kind of like a reverse of what happened in America. It's not quite as bad as that, but a lot of people die. So people show up, get sick, start dropping. So the crown sends a lot of common folk and nobles to the island, including the duke, to rule over it. The church sends a lot of common folk to the island, along with, people to enforce the church rule. But they are specifically attempting to erase island culture. So this is where the Draymonts begin to help the nobles control monsters on their land. Like, the new nobles come in and they just assume that this place is theirs, and the Draymonts are like, whatever, we're still gonna kill the monsters on your land. So it kind of leaves a bad taste in both the Draymonts and the nobles' mouths. Like, they kind of dislike each other right off the bat. So the vampire lord at this point is influencing the nobles to trust him, and obviously to distrust the Draymonts, simply because he doesn't like them, but mainly his goal is to make them trust him, to gain their trust. At this point, the hags and the witches are recruiting common folk, and they're continuing their experiments to make a new hag mother. This period, maybe 10 to 20 years, is a campaign by the church and the crown to erase the first folk culture. So the resistance is trying to prevent first folk culture from being erased. Now the first folk, the ones that aren't in the resistance, are mostly just trying to survive. They're trying to keep their families alive. So at this point, the common folk begin to adopt and pervert first folk holidays and customs. And there's a lot of common folk disappearances on the rise during this time. Of course, there's first folk disappearing as well, but they don't really pay attention to that. The crown and the church care about the common folk, and the fact that they're disappearing more and more often nowadays. Like, at first it's fine because, they're adapting to the island, but later on it's worrying because now they're just disappearing and we don't know why. At this point, the crown, the nobles, both the first folk nobles and the new ones being installed, are working with and against each other to gain power, and some of them fall under the influence of the vampire lord at this point. The church, during this whole period, is erasing island culture. That's, through hook or crook. That's what they're doing. So the Draymonts at this point begin to find lesser vampires and half hags, like horrifying abominations. They're also losing ground with the nobles because more vampires keep popping up, and the nobles have an easy finger to point because they're like, this is supposed to be your job, even though, Vampire Lord, at this point, finds a way to make lesser vampires. So the hags and the witches, their experiments result in success in the form of horrifying half-hags, which the Draymonts begin to find. This point right here this line in time, this is where I think it would be most appropriate for players to start influencing the story. So anything past this point, these 2 steps, this is what these groups will do if the players do not influence those groups at all. So this is what the resistance will do if left to their own devices. The first folk, the common folk, the crown, church, Draymons, all of this is what happens if the players leave them alone. They can choose to interact with any of them and stuff will happen, but this will, I think, at least help DMs to understand, like, okay, this is where all these groups are coming from, and this is where they're going. I'm gonna have to turn some lights on here. All right, now that I've got some light, all right, so this right here, I'm gonna go top down from here on out. So what happens during this time is the Vampire Lord actually frames the Elder Draymont for murder and adultery. I'll get into how he did that once I get to there, but for now, let's get to the hags and witches. Let's just go down the list this time. The hags have their first possible success in recreating the Hag Mother. They create an entity that they believe is going to be their next Hag Mother. The Vampire Lord, he takes the disguise of an Elder Draymont and murders a noble. And turns out he's been seducing that noble's granddaughter the whole time in the guise of a different, younger noble. So when they're caught and he dons the guise of the Elder Draymont, she's shocked, they're shocked, they don't know what's going on, but he had just murdered that noble and is very blatantly just doesn't, just is extremely nonchalant about it, being like overly theatric, and it doesn't seem like the Elder Draymont, but everyone saw it, So the Draymonts are framed for conspiracy against the crown because of the actions of the Elder and some other things that come to light. And so they are hunted. Both the church and the crown condemn the Draymonts, and the crown pronounces them enemies of the state, essentially. So I just realized I didn't mention this, but the Vampire Lord uses this opportunity to unveil his Vampire Guard, which he doesn't call them that in the story, I'm just calling them that for brevity, but they're essentially a fighting force that doesn't need sleep, will march endlessly. They have what looks like black plate armor on until you get up close, and then you see that it's actually just really dark blued. And when you stab them and you pull your blade out, they just bleed like a black tar and they don't go down. So these guys are ridiculously overpowered, and he only has so many of them, but they are extremely efficient and they only take orders from him. So anyways, just wanted to mention that's happening. So the common folk are participating in hunting the Draymonts. Some of the first folk are willing to help the Draymonts at this point. Pretty much all of the resistance are willing to help the Draymonts because they have been helping the first folk since forever, so they respect them, and at this point they use their network to attempt to get them out. So at this point the Vampire Lord has influenced the Duke to the point that he's just a puppet. So this is essentially what happens when the Vampire Lord actually gains control. So the hags and witches are essentially biding their time for the new Hag Mother to become their leader. They're not really interested in the rest of the politics. They have a fresh supply of bodies, they have their new Hag Mother, and through her, they'll be able to do some crazy stuff down the line. At this point, the Vampire Lord controls the noble houses and the army. I'm gonna have to move some stuff. So, as far as the Draymonts go, most of them are dead or have escaped, but 2 of them remain on the island. I'll tell a little tale about those 2 at the end of this. Now, the church, now that most of the Draymonts are gone or dead, are blaming the Draymonts for the rise in monster sightings. They claim that if they hadn't been doing what they were doing, there wouldn't be so many monsters hating and killing humans in the first place. No, the crown is just made into a puppet for the Vampire Lord. They just do whatever he wants at this point. Now, the common folk are, at this point, just scared, angry, and hungry. So the first folk, whether or not they're part of the resistance, are being blamed for helping the Draymonts at this point. The resistance begin to look toward the remaining Dreymonts for leadership. And I'll get into that, well, right now. So the point at which I want the players to enter the story is just before the Dreymonts are framed for everything and the vampire guard is released. So at this point, the Dreymonts are all alive, and all of that stuff is in the background. It's going to happen. So if they wanted to, they could play as a Dreymont. They could, that immediately alters these outcomes. Now what happens is when the vampire lord takes the disguise of the Elder Dreymont, murders a noble, and seduces that noble's granddaughter, that galvanizes the Church and the Crown against the Dreymonts. The common folk start to hunt, all that stuff goes down. What happens is the vampire guard storm the Dreymont hold, and during that event there are a few different groups that matter. One of them is a young Dreymont who is helping his mother and his younger siblings to escape. So he's guiding them through the castle, and some of the vampire guard, in fact only one of them, set upon them. He tells his mom and his siblings to escape, and he stays trying to fight the vampire guard off. He's not extremely, adept martially yet. He's still a teenager, but he's been training for a long time, so he's better than the average person, So he gets the upper hand, he stabs the vampire guard through, pulls it out, sees the black ichor upon his blade, and just flees. Even though some of his family members are still fighting inside, but at least he helped some of them get away. So he kind of beats himself up about this, and his path, it diverges for like a few months. We don't really see him for a little while, but separately from him, inside the keep, are two of the oldest Dreymonts. So there are two other Dreymonts in there, and they're on the same generation as him, so they are his siblings. They're the two eldest in his generation, his two eldest brothers. So they're back in the keep, defending everyone, allowing them to escape. One of them, has always been in the other brother's shadow, but they adventure together. They all hang out with similar groups of friends. They're good brothers, but he's always been living in his shadow because his brother is the leader, all that stuff. Well, the kid starts to hear tales of his oldest brother, his friend group and him helping the first folk during this time. So he goes on a little quest. After a while, he goes on this little quest to try and find his oldest brother. And eventually he tracks down some of his oldest brother's friends. And they're working essentially sort of like Robin Hood characters, where they're, robbing nobles and spreading it out to the people, and they're hunting monsters without taking pay, all that stuff. They're Robin Hood-ish kind of characters. Well, they recognize him, and they're like, oh my gosh, we gotta take you to see your brother. So they take him there, and he's excited to see his oldest brother, and he's happy he's still alive. As he makes it to the tent and his brother walks out, a frown dawns on his face because he realizes this isn't his oldest brother, this is, the second eldest brother. In their meeting, it's a very bittersweet moment where he essentially tells him he died in the defense of the keep, and so I essentially took up his mantle. I've always been living in his shadow, and now I'm carrying his shadow with me. So, that kind of thing. So, anyways, that's the outline for my setting. Thank you for listening to me rant. If you did, seriously, I love you. I have some more work to do on it, but this is like the basic outline. This is how everybody relates to each other. So if you understand this, thank you. I put some work into it. Anyways, if you like this, give me a like, give me a thumbs up, whatever it's called, subscribe. It seriously helps the channel. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks, bye.